everyone, this is your audio to accompany the lecture notes. In this particular lesson, we are looking at chapter 15, which is focused on the muscular system, and chapter 16. So please remember to utilize your textbook, the provided PowerPoint presentation, and do not neglect reading the actual textbook chapters. This is not a substitute. This presentation is not a substitute for reading and studying from the textbook chapters. So for this part of the presentation, the focus is on chapter 15 again, which is the muscular system. Remember to review and study the anatomy related to the muscles as noted in your textbook. Your authors provide some basic information on the functionality of the muscular system so you can refresh your memory on those particular areas. Once you do that, can you define, without reading it from the textbook, the four functions of the muscular system? Can you define and differentiate between a muscle and a tendon? Can you define a bursa? Can you define a ligament and discuss its function? So these are all things you need to think about without using your textbook or a medical dictionary, making sure that you have a complete understanding of the basic anatomy of the muscular system. When we look at ICD-10 PCS as a coding classification system, and we look at some of the common root operations, the first one is a tendolysis, which is a freeing of a tendon from adhesions, and is typically coded to the root operation of release. Again, all of these are dependent on the clinical documentation, so don't get it stuck in your brain that all tendolysis procedures will be coded to the root operation of release. Coding is not really about absolutes. It's about taking the clinical information and applying the guidelines to the definitions. These are just some generalizations in terms of common root operations. A tendinotomy is a cutting of a tendon by definition, so that could equate to the root operation of division because they're dividing the tendon. Tendolysis is a surgical anchoring of a tendon to a bone. With this particular one, it can be several root operations. It could be reposition, it could be reattachment, or repair. So it depends on how it's done, the procedure itself, how the tendodesis is done, and of course how it's documented. Reading of the operative report is key, as it always has been since we began this journey of ICD-10 PCS coding. Within your textbook chapter, she provides some pieces of information. Some places she calls them coding tips. I just tried to highlight specific ones here for you, and I'm calling them all coding tips. The first one here is if you have a specific tendon or a ligament or a bursa that's supporting a joint, and that particular piece of the person's body is what is the focus of the procedure, you code it to the related body part. So if it's a knee tendon, you would code it to the knee, etc. Muscles of the finger are considered part of the hand muscle body part in terms of body part character value. Muscles of the toes are considered part of the foot body part character value. Also, as you know by now, laterality is important. Was the physician working on the right side or the left side? Right foot, right elbow? Where did this muscle lie on this patient, right side versus left side? And if it's bilateral, that's also important, because if we can't capture bilateral in our code assignment with one code, we have to assign two codes, one for the right side and left side. In general, remember that there are no natural orifices or ways to get into a patient's muscle via a natural entry. So you can't access someone's shoulder muscle through a natural root. They're going to have to make some type of incision, whether it's a small incision such as percutaneous or a large incision, which we would call open, to get into someone's shoulder joint or shoulder muscles. Device character values are also limited for our muscular system. So typically you will always see Z's used for the device character values. For the qualifier character values in this particular system, we're talking about the muscular system, they are used and they represent layers transferred in addition to the muscle that's involved in the procedure. So if we're doing muscle transfer procedures, you may see the qualifier values utilized on that particular ICD-10 PCS table. Moving forward, if we go deeper into the body, underneath our muscles are bones, which we call the skeletal system. So again, review the function and organization of bones and joints. You have that anatomy given to you in the front of chapter 16. You also have definitions and information about the types of bones of our bodies. We have different types of bones. We also have different terminology used for bone surfaces such as condyle, facet, foramen, head, spine, etc. Can you define a facet? Can you define a sinus? What is the difference between a condyle and a turbuncle? What is another term for C1? We're talking about cervical vertebrae 1. What bones anatomically are classified or compose the orbit? So these are just questions that help you move through the anatomy as a review. Then if we look at some of the common root operations associated with ICD-10 PCS as a coding system, release is one, fusion and repair. One of the more common ones you will see often is reposition. Reposition is often used as a root operation when we are coding displaced fracture treatment. And just to review, a non-displaced fracture is a fractured bone, but the bone fragments are in alignment. There's no fragmentation of the bone. These are typically what they call clean breaks. And they may be casted, but there's no type of pinning done or anything like that. This is a non-displaced fracture. On the right here is a displaced fracture where the fragments are now out of alignment. The physician is going to have to go in and do something surgically with this to bring these pieces of the bone back together. They may have to put in some type of pin or something like that. Sometimes they can also put a pin in a non-displaced fracture. So you have to be careful. Again, coding is very tricky because nothing is 100%. I can't tell you that every fracture treatment of a displaced fracture is always, or a non-displaced fracture is always going to be coded a certain root operation. You have to look at the clinical picture. But in general, displaced fractures are going to be coded to the root operation of reposition because of the definition of that particular root operation, which is moving to its normal anatomical location, all or portion of a body part. So in the definition of a displaced fracture means it's not in alignment. Also in your textbook, figure 16.11 is a very helpful decision tree. It's to ask you questions, and if you answer yes, it leads you down one pathway. If you answer no, it leads you down another pathway. So if a patient, for example, has a femur fracture, if it's displaced, and the answer is yes to that question, and they put in some type of pin, The root operation would be repositioned, and you would also need to reflect the hardware of the pin in the device character value. The patient is after the surgery, the patient is put in a cast, but you would not code the casting separately. It would be part of the reposition. So that figure 16.11 is a very helpful decision tree for you to utilize in this class and beyond. Also, other coding tips in chapter 16, or that relate to the information in chapter 16, when we talk about indexing a capsulography, when you do that, it directs you to the root operation of repair, and you have to know which anatomical location, upper joint versus lower joint. Therefore, if we're doing a shoulder joint repair, we're going to focus in on, if the physician documents it, a ligament, and that would equate to the root operation of repair. If we find our clinical documentation talks about using nails or cement for fragile bones or bones that are fragile due to a fracture, we may look at the root operation of supplement. If we have a fracture that is reduced, like a non-displaced fracture, that is not required any type of surgical intervention to get the fractured pieces in alignment, but then they go in and they put in a pin, we might want to code reposition again. And I believe I gave you a picture of that. So this is an example here of a non-displaced fracture, and they're using, in this case, 3 little pins. Also, if they do have to debride a fracture as part of the repositioning, that is typically not coded separately. It's part of the fracture treatment. In terms of anatomy, you also have the dividing line in your body skeletally is your T12. Everything above T12 is considered upper, and everything below T12 is considered lower. So if you're thinking from your laterality standpoint, is a lumbar vertebrae considered upper or lower? It's considered lower because it's below T12. Common surgical approaches for bones and joints include open, percutaneous, endoscopic, and external. Remember your medical terminology. An arthrotomy, A-R-T-H-R-O-T-O-M-Y, means incision into a joint capsule. Arthro is joint, otomy is cutting into. Cutting into something in ICD-10 PCS world relates to an open procedure. If a patient is having a closed fracture reduction with a closed approach, there's no documentation of an incision, there's no documentation of it being a displaced fracture, most likely your surgical approach is external. The physician is not cutting into the patient to make sure their fracture is correct or in correct alignment. We do have devices used in this particular area of coding. You have internal devices such as intramedullary and external devices. When you have combinations of devices and or materials, there is a specific coding guideline on that, which is B3.10c. Combinations of devices and materials are often used on a vertebral joint. So we're talking typically about back surgery. When combinations are used on the same, there's 3 separate components in terms of the guideline. Depends on what the point is. If it's being done to make the joint immobile, if it's a bone graft, and if it's a mixture of the patient's own bone graft and non-donated stuff, so they're donating to themselves, or they're using some synthetic type material, something that's man-made. There's different components of that guideline that will be applied. We also will use the qualifier value at times in this particular area of coding on bones and joints. Guideline B3.10b identifies that a separate code is assigned for the fusion of each vertebral joint, where a different device or qualifier is assigned. So it's helpful if you practice, again, some of your coding related to the specifics of this particular area. They give you some helps in that area in terms of the code building exercises and, of course, the chapter exercises. Again, you have those at the end of each of those chapters, chapters 15 and 16. For chapter 16, you have a code building exercise that happens to do with the removal of an infected hip that was a replacement. You also have a fusion exercise, a posterior fusion of L5 to S1. You have also a laminectomy. You have an arthropathy of the foot. You have multiple practice. These are ones where they walk you through the answers. These are before you get to the check your understanding. So make sure you pay attention to those. Again, ask questions if you do not understand. Once you see the answer key for the assigned non-graded exercise at the end of chapters 15 and 16, if you're not understanding why your code is different, if you're off by one character, please post to the discussion board forum, or you can send me a communication via Canvas inbox.